Welcome to Record of Service. I'm your host, Maya Foster. Today's episode is a bonus episode. Earlier this year, we marked the 75th anniversary of the Allied invasion of Normandy, dubbed Operation Overlord and commonly known as D-Day. Just a warning to those that may be listening with young ones around, today's story contains graphic descriptions.
D-Day was supposed to happen on June the 5th, but because of the bad weather and the channel was very rough, they decided to put it off till June the 6th.
This is Lloyd Bentley, a Canadian airman from Northern Ontario who served with Britain's Royal Air Force. He flew with Transport Command, delivering troops and supplies to Allied forces.
At midnight, June the 5th, we had a job of dropping paratroops about 5 or 6 miles inland from Juno Beach. 400,000 people took part in D-Day, and about 156,000 landed that day. And there was about 250,000 in the Navy and Air Force and air crew.
By this time, Canada and its allies had been at war with the Axis powers since 1939. The Allies had lost control of continental Western Europe 4 years prior. But by 1943, the tides were beginning to turn due to the successes of the Battle of the Atlantic and the Italian campaign. The Allies initiated plans for an invasion set for the following summer. It would be the largest amphibious invasion in history. Just a quick note on the term D-Day. The term had been used to plan operations in the past, and all it really did was act as a placeholder for the specific and top secret date of an attack. Since the invasion of Normandy, it has been forever linked with June 6, 1944. Martin Maxwell was one of the paragliders to go in on D-Day. He was born in Vienna and was sent to Britain on the Kindertransport, which took approximately 10,000 Jewish children out of Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland to the United Kingdom after Kristallnacht and before the outbreak of the Second World War. After his adoptive brother joined the Royal Air Force, he decided to join the Royal Pioneer Corps, a corps open to German and Austrian nationals.
Now, when I finished my training, I went to one of the officers that I knew because he was the sports officer and I played soccer. And I said, look, I didn't join the army to dig ditches or to build bridges. I want to go to a fighting unit. So he transferred me to the tank corps. And there, one day, they got a request from the glider pilot regiment to send 2 of their best, or maybe 2 of their worst, to volunteer for the glider pilot regiment. And a great friend of mine who's not Jewish and I volunteered, and we passed. And we both took part in the D-Day operation. In fact, not he, but I went the night before on the first 6 gliders, and the whole idea was to capture the bridges behind the enemy line so that the Germans couldn't send reinforcements. I just carried those wonderful commandos, and they were out there. Within 20 minutes, it was a big battle, and the German garrisons were all dead. And we held the bridges until our paratroopers came in the night.
Here's Lloyd again, explaining the Allies' strategy.
They went from England in 3 different groups, 3 different lines. The westernmost line were the Americans, and the ships were down below. And then they had probably fighter planes, and then transport and medium bombers, etc. There's several heights of them. The westernmost line landed at Utah Beach, near St. Mary de Glees, and then the middle lane landed at Omaha Beach, and they were battle. They had really the toughest fighting of anybody. And then the easternmost lane was British and everybody else. And when they got nearer the shore, they split into 3 different lanes. And the westernmost lane was Gold Beach, were British. The middle lane was the Canadians at Juno Beach. And then the easternmost lane was the British, French, Free French, Norwegians, etc., Dutch. And they landed at Sword Beach. As you got near England, you could see all the 3 lanes are still coming out, about 40 miles wide probably. I swear you could see about 2,000 or 3,000 aircraft, or 13,000 aircraft took part, and there's between 5,000 and 7,000 ships. And I swear if I had long legs and stepped out on those ships, I could have walked back to England. They were so thick. It was the most amazing sight I've ever seen in my life.
Haviland Chiazon, a member of the North Shore Regiment, remembers the experience of approaching the French coast by boat.
When we boarded the ships, they pulled out the maps and put them out on the tables in the big mess hall aboard ship and said, you know, this is D-Day. We're landing in France. And so it was a 6-hour trip across to the coast of France. So we got there in the morning about 5 o'clock in the morning, and the big guns opened up, the Navy guns. The artillery opened up that were there aboard ships. And the planes came in, bombed the beaches, and then we came down out of our big ships into our landing craft. And then the orders were, of course, the orders were then to hit the beach as soon as you could. And these boats were all operated by Navy men, experienced Navy men. So when you hit the beach, when you got to the place where you hit the beach, the big ramp went down and the 36 men piled up. But sometimes they hit a reef and the ramp would go down. Several would be drowned with all their equipment. Others would swim to shore. Some would be killed from the artillery. And the Germans, of course, had to open up with everything they had. But we hit our beach at St. Albans-sur-Mer. That's where the North Shore landed.
They captured a mile of beach on the first day and spent the night there.
We were together for like 5 years or 5.5 years. We were just like brothers. And then all of a sudden, here's all these people, dead, dead or wounded. Most of them dead. We lost, I think we lost 100 people killed that morning on the beach, besides the wounded. So it takes quite a jolt out of you the first day. But then after the first day, the battle is over and you say, what about Jim? Oh, he was killed. You don't think anything about it, see. And of course you couldn't do anything because, here would be a brother, as I would call him, would be wounded real bad right there. And you'd want to stop and bandage him up or do something before the orderlies. You weren't allowed to. You had to go on. That wasn't your job. I bandaged up a lot of fellows, and a lot of my friends did too, when you were stopped. But when you were on the advance, you couldn't do anything like that. You couldn't stop and help anybody.
Just a heads up, this next section contains descriptions of D-Day casualties. Here's Lloyd again.
I used to be very squeamish if I saw a little bit of blood before this day. But when we got in the plane, here there was 25 or 30 wounded. Some had belly wounds, some had jaws shot off, arms and legs missing, and the shock was so great, from then on, blood never bothered me at all.
Ontario nurse Ruth Mugridge arrived in England in May 1944. She was stationed in a British military hospital.
We switched our status to a casualty clearing station when we received the wounded personnel from hospital trains, one after midnight and one at around 3 o'clock in the morning. And there were about 300 or so wounded personnel on each train. So we were all kept very, very busy. I was in the burn ward, and we got mostly the Armored Corps boys. And our patients, I must say, were wonderful young men. And they were so grateful for anything we were able to do for them. One of our big pluses was the fact that we had penicillin, and it made a big difference in the amount of infections that would turn up in the different types of wounds. But we were very fortunate to have it available to our military service, as there was none available to the civilian hospitals in Canada until after the war.
Record of Service is a production of the Memory Project Speakers Bureau and Archive, connecting veterans and Canadian Forces members with school and community groups from coast to coast. The Memory Project has been made possible in part by the Government of Canada. We're a program of Historica Canada, a nonprofit offering programs that you can use to explore, learn, and reflect on Canadian history and what it means to be Canadian. Go to thememoryproject.com to browse our archive of interviews or to book a speaker for your classroom or community event. If you're a veteran or an active member of the Canadian Forces, contact us to find out how you can become a speaker. Additional text for this episode comes from our sister program, the Canadian Encyclopedia. If you like this episode and want to learn more about the Battle of Normandy, check out their article at thecanadianencyclopedia.ca. You can follow us on social media at memory_project and at Historica Canada. Bye for now.
One of my brothers, he was a code talker too. His name was Peter, and he was a hard-working man. You know, you couldn't find a better man to work. Come payday, he'd go on a toot, till time to go back to work, and he'd drink to get drunk, and then he'd cry. He'd sit there and cry, "I should have been killed. I should have been killed."
Welcome to Record of Service, a podcast presented by Historica Canada. I'm your host, Maya Foster. In this series, we bring you interviews with Canada's veterans, their stories of life, loss, and service. In this episode, we hear from Frank Tompkins. Just a warning to those that may be listening with young ones around, today's story contains mature content. For some Indigenous people, joining the Canadian Armed Forces during the World Wars provided certain benefits, like the opportunity for employment and the chance to claim rights and challenge social barriers. Of course, not all felt this way. Some saw the wars as white people's wars, and therefore chose to stay out of it. And while opportunities were afforded to Indigenous participants during the conflict, they often ended when the war did. Frank is Métis, which it should be noted he pronounces as Métis. He was a private in the Canadian Army during the Second World War and one of more than 4,300 Indigenous people to serve at home and abroad during that time. At 18, Frank enlisted in the Canadian Army. It was 1945 and near the end of the Second World War. Frank had been inspired by his 4 brothers who had gone overseas. Here he talks about why members of his community joined up.
In our part of the country, they just about cleaned up all the men, because in those days, there was a shortage of work to start with, and this was, of course, employment as well as doing something for your country. So there was a great number of people from my part of the country that was in the armed forces, a great number of them. Altogether, there was, I think, 27 altogether, my immediate family group that was in the service during the Second World War, and I had a couple uncles in the First World War.
Incredibly, 2 of the Tompkins brothers served in top-secret roles as code talkers. While we don't have any information about Peter, Charles was recruited by the United States Army Corps headquarters.
This American officer approached my brother Charles, and of course, asked a few questions as to how many Cree-speaking and English-speaking people that he knew. And of course, he named my brother, Peter, and there was a few others from his hometown that he knew. It was Walter McDermott, and Archie Plant.
When Charles was stationed in England, he was summoned with 100 other Indigenous soldiers without any indication of what they would be doing. The Canadian military headquarters representatives paired up soldiers who spoke the same Indigenous language. Charles was paired with another Cree speaker to test his fluency. The partners returned accurate translations, and Charles was assigned to the U.S. 8th Air Force and the 9th Bomber Command.
The American Army, of course, were the ones really interested in code talkers, and what they were used for in the early part of the war was first they did a little bit of training, how to interpret certain types of aircraft and stuff, and then they were placed at different airports, and then they'd send a message in Cree, how many aircraft, what kind of aircraft was going to be going on this bombing run in England, and they were translated back into English.
To clarify, code talkers first translated the Allies' messages into their languages and then were sent into the field, where another code talker translated the message back into English. The information and orders were then passed up to commanders. Some of the words, like plane, bomber, and machine gun, did not exist in Indigenous languages. For these, code talkers needed to repurpose existing words. For instance, Charles Tompkins would translate Mustang aircraft to the Cree word for wild horse, Pakwatstatim. During both World Wars, hundreds of Indigenous servicemen from across North America transmitted classified information in their languages and stymied the efforts of the enemy trying to decode Allied messages. Charles Tompkins did not reveal his secret role until the end of his life, and many code talkers never spoke of their work.
My grandmother, being the Plains Cree, and a widow of pawnmaker, and quite a family history there as far as like her uncle was Big Bear. He was quite active during the uprising. And of course, growing up on the reserve and with the customs and all, she was a strong believer in the Indian ways. And she taught my brothers an Indian song. If they were ever in combat and in a very dangerous position, to sing this war song that she taught them.
The Tompkins family had a connection to the Northwest Resistance of 1885. The resistance was a 5-month insurgency by Métis and First Nations against the Canadian government in what is now Saskatchewan and Alberta. The nations had legitimate grievances with the government's colonial policies and the encroachment of settlers on their territories. The resistors were eventually quashed by federal troops and jailed. Louis Riel was tried and hanged for treason, and 6 Cree and 2 Assiniboine warriors were hanged at Battleford. Indigenous peoples who had been oppressed and abused under the treaties of the 1870s found that they were further subjugated and more closely administered by the Government of Canada. Frank Tompkins' grandfather was Irish, but he was raised by a Cree nanny and he spoke Cree fluently. He was captured during the Northwest Resistance while repairing a damaged telegraph wire, and he observed much of the conflict. Here's Frank describing his grandfather's experience after the fighting ended.
He ended up at the trial of Louis Riel, and he was really sympathetic with the Métis cause because he said the Métis were right, and Louis Riel was right in trying to get something done for the Métis people. After that, later on, my grandfather got a job as a farm instructor in Pawnmakers Reserve. And that's where he met and married my grandmother. And speaking Cree fluently, of course, he just naturally fit in.
Around this time, the Government of Canada also began establishing industrial schools across the prairies. These schools were eventually part of the national system of residential schools designed to assimilate Indigenous youth into white society. On a large scale, children were removed from their families and stripped of their languages, cultures, and ways of knowing. As a child, Frank was a student at St. Bernard Residential School in Gruard, Alberta, where he was witness and subject to countless abuses. He remembers one instance in which a nun enlisted students to assist in the punishment of a classmate.
Of course, the way it was in those days, nobody helped him, nobody did nothing. They're so brainwashed in the residential school. And my dad happened to come to visit one day. I told him what happened. And he went to the priest, of course, to complain. And I got the biggest licking I ever had in my life. She used one of these things on me. And it's only because I was young and agile that I could move quick enough. She only hit the flesh of my legs and the backside. And if she'd have hit a bone, I'm sure it might have broke a bone or something. That's how severe a beating I got in residential school. And that I told my father. That's when he says, to hell with us. He took us out of school and moved us to this place called Jussard.
At the close of the Second World War, the federal government enacted legislation to benefit returning service personnel. The program offered vocational training, land grants for farming, and business loans. However, these benefits were seldom extended to Indigenous veterans.
There was discrimination after the war for most of the Aboriginal veterans, because in the Legion, and I suppose you could say the same for just about any veterans organization, the executive on these organizations were white.
For the Tompkins family, access to the benefits outlined in the Veterans Charter was routinely denied.
Preference was given to white veterans on everything. And I'll give you an example of this. My brothers, they made frequent trips to Edmonton to try to get a grant or a loan to start up something, like commercial fishing. It was mostly commercial fishing and mink ranch in those days. And they went to go to Edmonton to try to get a grant. And the train in them days ran 3 times a week. So if you went to Edmonton, you had to have an overnight deal before you could come home again. So they'd go to Edmonton. They made about 3 trips to Edmonton and come back tomorrow, come back next week. Finally, they give up. And I'd say about 99% of the Metis people and the Indian people that tried that were given the same kind of response. Come back next week.
15 non-Indigenous men from Frank's hometown received the grants denied to his family. These men would go on to establish successful businesses in mink ranching and commercial fishing.
And this is the treatment that our people got after the war.
Record of Service is a production of the Memory Project Speakers Bureau and Archive, connecting veterans and Canadian Forces members with school and community groups from coast to coast. The Memory Project has been made possible in part by the Government of Canada. We are a program of Historica Canada, a nonprofit offering programs that you can use to explore, learn, and reflect on Canadian history and what it means to be Canadian. Go to thememoryproject.com to browse our archive of interviews or to book a speaker for your classroom or community event. If you're a veteran or an active member of the Canadian Forces, please contact us to find out how you can become a speaker. If you liked this episode and want to learn more about the history of Indigenous Crown relations in Canada, check out the Treaties and Residential Schools learning tools at education.historicacanada.ca. Additional text for this episode comes from our sister program, the Canadian Encyclopedia. You can find links to their articles on Louis Riel, Poundmaker, Big Bear, Indigenous veterans, and more at thecanadianencyclopedia.ca. Follow us on social media at memory_project and at Historica Canada. Bye for now. Next time on Record of Service.
So we thought, wow, once we're here, we'll never get out alive. Nobody will ever know we've been here. Nobody even knows where we are. You could hear the moans and groans and agonies of people being tortured by the Gestapo. You could hear shots ringing out. So we thought, wow, once we're here, we'll never get out alive. Nobody will ever know we've been here. Nobody even knows where we are. You could hear the moans and groans and agonies of people being tortured by the Gestapo. You could hear shots ringing out.
Welcome to Record of Service, a podcast presented by Historica Canada. I'm your host, Maya Foster. In this series, we bring you interviews with Canada's veterans, their stories of life, loss, and service. This episode will focus on the story of Edward Carter Edwards, a Canadian airman who was shot down over France. Just a warning to those that may be listening with young ones around, today's story contains graphic descriptions.
I don't remember this. I don't remember pulling the ripcord. I don't remember counting up to 10. I do remember the parachute opening, and I do remember floating down. You hear all kinds of stories, and you hear all kinds of sad experiences, and so you get to know what targets were the worst ones. And the ones that stuck out most of all was the one to Berlin, because it was a long haul, it was dangerous, it was probably 6 or 7 hours in the flight, and so you would spend many hours over enemy territory, exposed to flak, fighters, searchlights, but you always thought it wasn't going to be you, it was going to be somebody else, so everything went quite well till number 22. We took off on the 7th of June, and this is our target, and so it was a railway yard, and so that our purpose was to destroy this target. We took off, and we're just minutes from dropping our bomb when the whole aircraft shook, just as if somebody was hitting it with a sledgehammer.
The captain alerted his crew to prepare to abandon the aircraft. A German fighter had flown underneath their plane and fired.
We had to bail out in a heck of a hurry. And it wasn't until many, many years later that I met my navigator, and he said, "Do you remember the night we got shot down?" And I said, "Well, kinda. I don't remember." I said, "I don't remember leaving the aircraft." He said, "Well, no wonder. You were sitting in the escape hatch at the front of the aircraft. And I froze. I didn't know this, and I don't remember, but I froze in that position, which meant I blocked Gordy's exit, the navigator, who was behind me. He couldn't get out. So he said, all I did was put my foot on your back and shoved you out because I want to get out too.
When their Halifax bomber crashed, the blaze lit up the countryside. He and his crew were on the ground, separated, in German-occupied France.
I could see the Seine River. I could see a white church steeple sticking up. I could see what looked like a forest on one side. And just before I entered the forest, I stopped and looked back towards the burning aircraft, and there was a shadow running towards me.
It was the bomb aimer from his crew. The two men hugged.
And as we ran towards the bush, it looked like a path. So we buried our chutes under some bushes, and then we ran along this path together. We came to a fork in the path, and Tom was not visible in front of me, and I couldn't hear him. So I called, Tom, where are you?
Edward didn't know which path Tom had taken. Years later, he would discover that, in fact, Tom had turned left and was picked up by the French resistance. Tom would remain with the Maquis until the Allies liberated France. Edward, however, turned right.
Came into a little village, and I knocked on several doors, and there was a gate. And I stood there, I looked, and sure enough, there was two women there. And I said in my poor high school French, "Avez-vous le pain, s'il vous plaît?" Which means, have you any bread, please? And the one lady said to me, in good English, "Who are you? What do you want? What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm a Canadian airman. I was shot down a few nights ago. I need food. I need help. I want to be in touch with the underground. I'd like to get back to England." So she ushered me into the house, took me into the kitchen, gave me a bowl of hot milk and bread, and she said, "Now, you can't stay here because if the Gestapo find you here, you may not be executed, but we will."
Edward stayed with the women for a couple of days until a young man and woman brought him a fake French passport. The couple promised Edward safe passage to Spain.
Anyway, the driver drove through Paris pretty fast. And the last thing I remember seeing was the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. He stopped at a Gestapo roadblock. He got out and he went over to somebody within authority, and immediately 6 or 7 of the military came with the car. They opened up the door of the car, and they physically pulled us out of the car like sacks of potatoes, threw us down the ground, and proceeded to beat the living daylights out of us with their jackboots and rifles. And we're lying on the ground, hurt, bleeding, sore, scared. And this great big German standing over me, and I got up and stood in front of him, and he pulled out his Luger, and he jabbed it right between my eyes, and I stand in front of him. He says, in good English, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I'm a Canadian airman. I demand protection under the Geneva Convention. You're not airmen, you're all spies and saboteurs, and will be executed as such."
For more than a month, Edward and his comrades languished in Fresnes, a German-run French prison.
So the 4 of us in a little cell about 6 by 8, and one of us slept on just a wrought iron cot that was attached to the wall. The other 3 of us slept on the floor, and it was a horrible, horrible, horrible place. You find out in a hurry, the place is lousy with fleas, and so we used to take time among ourselves, the 4 of us, in order to maintain our sanity, to go through the seams of our clothing, to see how many fleas we could kill in competition.
Soon, their fate took a turn for the worse.
So they gathered everybody up, and they took us by trucks and buses down to the railway yard in Paris, where we were forced into these little French cattle car, like sardines in a can. You can hardly sit, you can hardly stand, you can hardly do anything. And so you're almost like doubled up. A young French lad of about 17 or 18 happened to be looking out the window, and he put his hand on the edge of the window frame. And the German guard walking by saw it, and he shot at him. And the bullet went through his hand. And so they opened up the door of the car and said, "Has anybody in here been hurt?" And our boys thought they were doing the right thing. They said, "Yeah, this young lad got shot in the hand." So the German guard ordered him out of the car, made him march down the embankment. They shot him in the back. And as he fell convulsively, he didn't die. And so a German officer coming along came over and put a few more rounds in the back of his head and then they closed the doors and we took off.
The train's last stop was Buchenwald. Established in 1937, it was one of the largest concentration camps built on German soil. The Allied airmen shouldn't have been sent there. They should have been sent to a prisoner of war camp.
At the beginning, we didn't eat the bread they gave us, which was a composition of who knows what, and we would throw it away. Other men hung around us, and they would die for this bread like a pack of hungry wolves. After a while, we ate this bread because it was the only thing we had.
According to camp records, some 240,000 prisoners from 30 different countries passed through its walls. It had no gas chambers on site, but 10,000 of its prisoners would eventually be sent to extermination camps, while an additional 43,000 died from malnutrition, disease, and violence at the hands of camp guards.
It's very difficult to convince and tell people the cruelty, the sadism, the brutality that took place in this, I call it the gates of hell, because they couldn't keep up with the dead and dying. As a matter of fact, they had a hut, one of the huts where you could see bodies piled in there, just like cordwood waiting to go into the crematorium. I had to go and work in the quarry for 2 days, which would have taken me if it had not been for the help of a young Dutch lad who was a prisoner in Buchenwald. He said, I'm going to take your name off the work list and put you down as having died. What you do with your time is up to you, but the least I can do is so that you would not have to go out and work in the quarry, because if I had, I would never have made it. The quarry was really a death sentence. It was a death sentence for a lot of Russians and a lot of the Jewish people. It was basically a place where they tortured you, not physically, but they tortured by working you to death.
And then, a miracle.
Somehow or another, the German Air Force found out there was Allied airmen in Buchenwald. And around the middle of October 1944, they came in and they literally snuck out of Buchenwald roughly 152, 54 Allied airmen. 12 of us were so sick we couldn't be moved. As a matter of fact, we were dying. And so we were left behind till the day when a German officer stood there beside where I was lying on a cot, and he said, I'm taking you to Steiger 3.
To clarify, the officer told Edward he was going to a prisoner of war camp for Allied airmen.
And it's a miracle. It's a miracle to think that somehow the German Air Force, who was our enemy in combat, but comrades in arms, found out that there was Allied airmen in Buchenwald, and they saved our lives. We were all slated to be hung on the meat hooks.
Record of Service is a production of the Memory Project Speakers Bureau and Archive, connecting veterans and Canadian Forces members with school and community groups from coast to coast. The Memory Project has been made possible in part by the Government of Canada. We are a program of Historica Canada, a nonprofit offering programs that you can use to explore, learn, and reflect on Canadian history and what it means to be Canadian. Go to thememoryproject.com to browse our archive of interviews or to book a speaker for your classroom or community event. If you're a veteran or an active member of the Canadian Forces, please contact us to find out how you can become a speaker. Additional text from this episode comes from our sister program, the Canadian Encyclopedia. If you liked this episode and want to learn more about Canada and the Holocaust, check out the Canadian Encyclopedia's article at thecanadianencyclopedia.ca. If you like what we do, consider making a donation to Historica Canada at historicacanada.ca.